Hi guys, welcome back to Kingdom Come Deliverance for some more reading. This time of the characters you can discover, I suppose. This is the second attempt at this video. The first time I tried to record it, I lost quite a big piece of footage for some reason which I can't really explain, except the PlayStation just ate it and didn't save the whole video. But yeah, hopefully that won't happen this time. I've got my glass of water at hand because I will need it. Yep, so without further ado, let's get reading. This first entry is a bit awkward to read because it's just a list of names. The Abbots of Sasau Monastery. A chronological list of abbots and superiors of the monastery from its origins up until 1405. The year after the name indicates when from. 1. Saint Procopius, 1035. 2. Vitus, 1053. 3. Emiram, 1086. 4. Bojatech, 1092. 5. Dethard, 1097. 6. Sylvester, 1134. 7. Bojata, 1161. 8. Reginald, 1162. 9. Unlisted. It's interesting. 10. Blage, 1202. 11. John the First, 1276. 12. Matthew, 1321. 13. Przemysław, 1332. 14. Albert, 54, apologies. 15. Peter of Zbyszów, 1377. 16. John II, 1405. And 17. Nevlas, 1405. You get the chance to meet John and Nevlas in the game, while Peter is only spoken of but not present. Next entry is Albert IV of Habsburg. Albert IV of Habsburg was an Austrian count, son of Albert III, with whom he fought against King Wenceslas IV, beginning in 1394. He also had disputes with Procopius of Luxembourg over the Czech-Austrian border. Next is Avicenna, a scientist and historian of Persia, one of the fathers of medicine. He studied from childhood, learning logic, metaphysics, and astronomy. He devoted most of his time to medicine and philosophy, and even experimented with remedies on his own body. He was always surrounded with students with whom he enjoyed debating. He was also a keen observer of the night sky. During his lifetime, he wrote at least 450 works, of which some 240 have survived to this day, including 150 books concerning philosophy and 40 on medicine. The remainder are on astronomy, alchemy, geography, and geology, psychology, Islamic theology, logic, mathematics, physics, and poetry. His theories and discoveries fascinated not only scholars of neighboring countries, but also the whole of Europe. The Czech Reform preacher Master Jan Hus also referred to Avicenna's writings. Next, Charles IV. Charles IV of Luxembourg, born Wenceslas, son of King John of Luxembourg, was the second member of the Luxembourg dynasty to become King of Bohemia, and the first to attain the title Holy Roman Emperor. He held many other titles besides: Margrave of Moravia, Count of Luxembourg, King of Italy, King of the Romans, and King of Burgundy. Renowned for his diplomatic skills and erudition, he actively endeavored to consolidate his position and ensure the survival of his line in Europe, especially in Bohemia, Moravia, and Germany. He was well versed in several languages, and at the French court he was tutored by none other than the future Pope Clement VI. During his reign, Prague and the lands of the Bohemian crown underwent a major transformation, becoming a powerful political, economic, and cultural center. For this reason, this period of his reign is known as the Golden Age. He initiated the construction of many superb edifices, which thus bear his name, including Charles University, Charles Bridge, and Karlstein Castle. He was keen to emphasize the role of religious faith in society. He renewed the cults of Saint Wenceslas, Saint Sigismund, and Saint Vitus, consecrating various church buildings to them, among others Prague Cathedral. He married 4 times and had 13 children, most of whom died in infancy. The most illustrious of his offspring were his sons Wenceslas and Sigismund, who both became rulers over the lands of the Bohemian crown. Next, Cumans. The Cumans first arrived in Czech lands in 1260. Under the leadership of the Hungarian crown prince Stephen, they fought against Bishop Bruno and the army of the Austrian lords, which they thoroughly vanquished. The Cumans appeared for the second time in the 1270s, when they defeated the army of King Przemysł Otakar and went on to pillage Moravia. They last invaded the Czech lands under Sigismund of Luxembourg, who could afford no better mercenaries than the Cumans. Estimates speak of several thousand fighters. One of the places that succumbed to their ravages was Silver Skalitz, the birthplace of our game's hero. Next is Heinrich III von Rosenberg. Henry III of Rosenberg, the only son of Aldrich I of Rosenberg, was Prague burgrave in the years 1396 to 1398 and 1400 to 1404. He also held the position of Lord of the Upper Castle in Bohemian Krumlov and was a member of the noble opposition group known as the League of Lords. He took part in the capture and imprisonment of Wenceslas IV in 1394 and again in 1402. Between 1389 and 1409, he held the position of executioner, as recorded in the Rosenberg Lords' Book of Executions. Around 1400, Henry was presented with a statue of the Madonna and Child crafted in the parlour workshop, now known as the Krumlov Madonna. Next is Jaroslav of Bezmire and Benesov. Jaroslav of Bezmire, aka of Benesov, was appointed an auxiliary bishop of Sarepta by Pope Boniface, or Boniface, I don't know, the ninth in 1394, at which time he was a Bachelor of Theology, then a very high level of education. He probably completed his studies later, sometime around 1403 or 1409. He became an inquisitor sometime before 1408. In 1409 to 1410, he defended the position of Prague Archbishop Zbigniew Zajíc of Hasenberg and his actions against the teachings of John Wycliffe before the Roman Curia. During his career as inquisitor, he came into conflict with Jan Hus and his progressive ideas. He later participated in the trial of Bologna that resulted in the condemnation and burning of John Wycliffe's books. He was also named as a witness in a document demanding a harsher denunciation of Jan Hus for not attending the Bologna trial, although he himself had requested it. We know little of Jaroslav after this point, and it is assumed he was living abroad. The Papal Inquisition had been operating in Bohemia since 1257, when two Franciscan inquisitors arrived at the request of King Przemysł Otakara II and continued intermittently until the Hussite Revolution. In KCD, we decided to make use of Jaroslav as a very active inquisitor, although the period of the game is somewhat earlier than the time that he was appointed, and active as a papal inquisitor according to historical sources. As a titular bishop, however, he could have presided over trials if it was required. Next is Jobst of Moravia. Jobst of Moravia was Margrave of Moravia from 1375 and Elector of Brandenburg from 1388. He also held the throne of the King of the Romans, although he did so for a mere 15 weeks until his death. He was the son of John Henry of Luxembourg and the nephew of Emperor Charles IV. He achieved his standing in Europe due to military and political intrigues aimed primarily against members of his own dynasty, particularly Wenceslas IV, against whom he rebelled along with the Moravian forces in the so-called Margraviate Wars. He initially supported Sigismund of Luxembourg's efforts to seize the Bohemian crown, but in 1403 he began opposing him and together with Albert IV, Duke of Austria, took part in a rebellion against him. His previous support for Sigismund was probably motivated more by self-interest. It ensured him future influence as long as it seemed that Wenceslas would be deposed and Sigismund, or even Jobst himself, would take his place. His campaign against Wenceslas won him and other nobles many privileges. Then in 1402, when the situation changed, he rebelled against Sigismund and was even instrumental in liberating Wenceslas from captivity. We don't know whether the change was due to cunning or conscience, but to the end of his life he remained surprisingly loyal to Wenceslas IV. Towards the end of his life, he even stood against Sigismund in the election of King of the Romans, and won. He didn't enjoy the crown for long though, and died shortly after. Jobst was not only politically astute, but also a very thrifty governor. Many rulers, including Sigismund himself, were financially indebted to him. In his day, it was said that it was Jobst and not either Wenceslas or Sigismund who was the true uncrowned sovereign of Bohemia. At the time our game takes place, however, he was in debt up to his ears. Next is John Hus. Jan or John Hus was a priest and thinker and one of the most important Czech religious reformers and preachers. His works, inspired by the theological writings of John Wycliffe, played a key role in underpinning the essence of the Reformation. As of 1398, he worked and disseminated his teachings at Prague University, but as early as 1403, German professors there labeled him a heretic. 6 years later, up to 20,000 doctors, masters, and students were forced to leave Prague University as a result of theological disputes. From 1402, Hus preached at the Bethlehem Chapel in Prague, where all sermons were delivered not in Latin but in Czech. This place became the center of the Reformation in Bohemia. Because of his controversial relationship with the Church and opinions on Catholic ethics, Hus was persecuted and finally convicted of heresy by the Council of Constance, for which he was burnt at the stake. The followers of the reformist idea rallied together after the events at Constance, leading to the beginning of the Hussite Wars. Apologies for skipping most of the years and dates, but they kind of ruin the flow of reading for me. Next is John II of Liechtenstein, a member of the Council of the Moravian Margrave Jobst of Luxembourg, who, as one of only a few Moravian lords, did not fight against the king alongside Jobst. The Liechtensteins were a wealthy family, owning estates in the Styrian and Lower Austria regions from the 13th century onwards, their main seat being Mikolov, or Nikolsburg. The Liechtenstein princes were in close alliance with the Habsburgs and Luxembourgs. In the war against Sigismund, John of Liechtenstein supported Wenceslas, helping to rescue him from captivity, but by so doing fell out of favor with the Austrian dukes, who confiscated his estates around the Danube River and took him prisoner. After the death of Wenceslas, the Liechtensteins aligned with Sigismund. Next is John of Jenstein. John of Jenstein or Jenstein was Bishop of Meissen and Chancellor to King Wenceslas IV from 1376 and Archbishop of Prague from 1379. A serious illness during the worst outbreak of plague in Bohemia altered his disposition from that of a carefree man to a devoted servant of the Church. This did not meet with the approval of Wenceslas, however, who sent him to prison at Karlstein Castle, and in 1394 removed him from the office of Chancellor, which led to further conflicts between the Church and the kings. Subsequently, John finally gave up his office in 1396. His many writings include sermons, commentaries, tractates, essays, and poetry. Next is Konrad Kyeser, or Kieser. Konrad Kyeser of Eichstätt was a military engineer, a supporter of King Wenceslas IV, and the author of Belli Fortis, a manual on the military arts, which is the oldest example of a Kriegsbuch to appear in the Bohemian territories. Written in Latin hexameter, the book consists of 140 parchments with somewhat incomprehensible text. It is accompanied by elaborate drawings by Kyeser himself. The book must have been very popular at the time of its writing, as testified by the fact that more than 30 manuscripts have survived to this day. Konrad Kyeser's loyalty to the Bohemian king is attested by a number of drawings in the Göttingen manuscript, in particular a depiction of the king's royal tent with a number of the symbols typical for Wenceslas IV, such as a torse or wreath and the letter W. The main text is prefaced by a prologue and a long dedication to the King of Germany, Rex Romanorum, Rupert III of the Palatinate, which was probably an attempt to ingratiate himself into his services. Unfortunately, we will never know why he did not dedicate his work to Wenceslas IV. Apologies, there's a lot of traffic noise still. By still, I mean it's 8 o'clock at night, so you would think most people would be at home already. Anyway, the 10 chapters of Bella Fortis. Earlier it said Belli Fortis, and here it says Bella Fortis. Get your act together, warhorse. The 10 chapters of Bella Fortis are devoted to weaponry, siege warfare, and the use of various techniques for besieging towers and castles. They also include prescriptions for making medicine and instructions for preparing baths, information about torture devices, and even an illustration and description of a chastity belt. The book concludes with an Epikedion, a personal elegy written by Kyeser himself, with his portrait and personal details, parents and date of birth, as well as a horoscope from May 1402. Belli Fortis is an adroit compilation of military engineering and technology well known in Kyeser's epoch. The author based his book on various previous works, including De Mirabilibus Mundi and Liber Ignium by Marcus Grecus. Some parts are also based on personal experience. Next is Matthew of Janow. Matthew of Janow was an intellectual, writer, preacher, and theologian. He was born in Janow, a village in South Bohemia. He began his studies in Prague and completed them at the university in Paris, where he became a master of liberal arts. He never completed the study of theology he had begun. Following his return to Prague, he held a number of church offices and became the confessor of Archbishop Jan of Jenstein. His intellectual works concerned mostly with the study of the Bible, emphasizing Christ and the Eucharist, while on the other hand he criticized some subsequent non-biblical stipulations of the Church, which he regarded as lacking the authority of Scripture and sometimes contradicting it. He also criticized the papal schism of the time, the disunity of the Church, and the excessive cult of sacred images and saints. For some of his ideas and teachings he was suspected of heresy, but he cleared himself of such accusations before the Archbishop's vicar and revised some of his opinions. Matthew is regarded as one of the most significant Czech reformers before Jan Hus, together with the preacher Konrad von Waldhausen and Jan Milic of Kroměříž, who greatly influenced him. The entire progress of the early Czech Reformation was driven by criticism of the Church's material conditions, appeals to personal devotion, and frequent communion. Matthew's work was followed by that of the important Hussite theologian Jakubek of Stribro, who defended the taking of the Eucharist by both means, bread and wine, even for lay people. Next is Pope, which has a few sub-entries. The Pope is the supreme head of the Roman Catholic Church, Jesus Christ's deputy on earth, and cannot be removed from office. His word is regarded by the Church as infallible, equivalent in effect to the Holy Scriptures. At the time of our game, however, nothing was quite so straightforward. Due to the papal schism that lasted from 1378 to 1417, there were for a time as many as 3 rival claimants to the throne of St. Peter. For secular rulers, support for one claimant or the other was often less a question of faith than of political convenience. Then, it's just a bunch of popes. Also, I forgot to mention at the beginning that, as you may have noticed, I'm missing 14 out of the 46 entries, so, which is a bit puzzling because, I thought I'd seen everything in the game. I finished almost all of the side quests, so I'm not sure how I could have missed so many. But anyway, first is Pope Urban VI. Urban VI, born Bartolomeo Prignano, was quickly elected Pope under pressure from the Roman people to have a citizen of the city on the papal throne, and the papacy returned there from Avignon, to which it had been relocated at the beginning of the century by the French king. Urban truly did begin to rule from Rome, and once he took office, also to criticize the cardinals for accepting gifts from rulers and living in luxury. This made him many enemies, so shortly thereafter the French cardinals declared his election invalid and elected a new pope, who once again ruled from Avignon. The new pope declared Urban to be the Antichrist and excommunicated him. This led to the Great Schism, financial, theological, and political duality, and chaos throughout Europe, because each ruler had to declare which pope they recognized as head of the church. Then we have Pope Benedict XIII. Benedict XIII, born Pedro de Luna, was elected anti-pope in 1394 in Avignon. He had previously withdrawn his allegiance to the Italian Pope Urban VI, who represented the Catholic Church in Rome. Then it's Pope Boniface or Boniface IX. I assume it's Boniface, but yeah, I just have to choose one pronunciation and stick to it, really. Pope Boniface IX, born Pietro Tomicelli, was pontiff from 1389, contemporaneously with the Avignon anti-popes Clement VII and Benedict XIII. He refused to abdicate, leading not only to a continuation of the Western Schism, but also to an ever-deepening rift in the Church. However, it also meant that Boniface had a growing influence on some important aspects of secular power. And the last pope is Pope Clement VII. Clement VII, born Robert of Geneva, was the first anti-pope elected by the French cardinals in opposition to the Roman Pope Urban VI, as an expression of their disagreement with the Italian pontiff's decision to remove the seat of papal power from Avignon, as well as his views that the clergy should lead a more austere and virtuous lifestyle. This event caused the Western Schism, which split the papacy. Next is Racek Kobyla of Dvojitz. Racek, in KCD Radzig, Kobyla, was a Bohemian yeoman. I don't know how you pronounce that. Yeoman. The royal hetman of Wenceslas IV, and between 1410 and 1415, Burgrave of Vyšehrad. In 1403, he resided at the castle in Silberskalitz, where he oversaw the mining of silver. The king was known for his generosity to lower nobles, who received high titles for their loyalty. Racek Kobyla was apparently one of these, and probably the king's friend. In 1403, Skalitz was besieged and burned to the ground by King Sigismund and his Cuman army. For his service and loyalty, King Wenceslas IV permitted Racek to build his own castle at Veseli nad Sasau. Standing on this site today is Chateau Komorny Hradec. He was killed in 1416 in a tavern in Kutna Hora by a mob of miners, incited by preachers a year after the burning of Jan Hus. They seized them in the inn where they were staying, cut their bodies into pieces and threw them out into the street, where the mob vigorously stomped on their remains and then went in merry along to the home of the preacher to be praised for the act they had been encouraged to commit. This occurred when Racek was there to collect taxes for the king, which is odd because 6 years earlier he had apparently been a robber knight and soldiers had been dispatched against him as a scourge of the land. Sources are not clear as to why he was later rehabilitated for services to the king. Next is Saint Procopius. Saint Procopius of Sasau was a lay priest, hermit, and co-founder and first abbot of Sasau Monastery. He was canonized in 1204. According to hagiography, he was educated at a school in Vyšehrad. He was married and had a son, but decided to become a priest. He spent some time with the Benedictines in Břevnov before embarking on the life of a hermit. In Sasau, he gathered a group of men around him with whom he founded a monastery of the religious order of Saint Benedict in the 1030s, becoming its first abbot. Many legends have arisen about Saint Procopius, in which the hermit does battle with demons and performs exorcisms. In one, he puts a demon to work, dragging his plough, digging out the so-called devil's furrow. He was thus often depicted with a tied and bound devil by his feet. Sometimes he was pictured with a crutch and mitre, and from the 17th century onwards he was presented holding a book and cross. The Sasau monastery houses the cave of Procopius, which was hollowed into the cliff wall in the shape of a Greek cross, and the saint is said to have spent several years as a hermit in it in solitary prayer. Next is Sigismund of Luxembourg. Sigismund of Luxembourg, son of Charles IV, was King of Hungary and Croatia from 1387, King of Germany from 1411, King of Bohemia from 1419, and King of Italy from 1431. He was also Prince of Silesia, from 1419 Margrave of Lusatia, and most notably Holy Roman Emperor between 1433 and 1437. At an early age, he was sent to be educated at the Hungarian court, quickly mastering the tough conditions of politics. Like other members of his family, he was abducted at least once, in his case by the Hungarian nobility. Having lost faith in the Hungarian nobility, he turned his attention to Bohemia and became engaged in hostilities with his half-brother Wenceslas. Some of the Bohemian nobility welcomed Sigismund, hoping he would rid them of their ineffective monarch, while others sided with Wenceslas, resulting in long-lasting wars, in the course of which Sigismund and his Hungarian army, consisting in no small part of Cuman mercenaries, repeatedly pillaged Bohemia, often with the help of the Bohemian and especially Moravian lords themselves. Sigismund fought not only to seize his brother's throne, but also against the Hussites with the aim of seizing the imperial crown. He regarded himself as the defender of Christianity, and in 1409 even founded the Order of the Dragon to wage war against all enemies of the Christian faith. One of the later members of the order was the infamous Vlad the Impaler, inspiration for the fictional Dracula. After the death of Wenceslas, Sigismund brought to Bohemia 4 unsuccessful crusades against the Hussites. He died soon after the signing of the Compacts, a set of agreements with the reformers guaranteeing freedom of religious belief to every inhabitant of the lands of Bohemia and Moravia. Next is Sir Markvart von Aulitz. He was the hetman or governor of Prague, who, much like those members of the nobility disgruntled with the reign of Wenceslas IV, saw in Sigismund of Luxembourg a better potential king. Their motivation had more to do with money and power. Wenceslas offered them no prospects, while supporting Sigismund promised them a better future position in society. Next is Sir Smil Flashka. Smil Flashka of Pardubice and Richemburg was a Czech nobleman, the nephew of the first Czech Archbishop, Ernest of Pardubice. He is known mainly as a writer. He received his bachelor's degree at the University of Prague in 1367. In the 1380s, he was in dispute with Wenceslas IV, trying to prevent Pardubice from falling into the hands of the king as an escheat. It's probably not how you say that. Anyway. Although he lost, in 1390 he inherited the Pardubice and Reichenberg estates, and 6 years later he was appointed supreme scribe of the provincial records. From 1403 he held the position of hetman of the Jaroslav region and was a member of the League of Lords. He died in fighting against the Kutna Hora, Kuttenberg, allies of Wenceslas IV. He wrote allegorical verse, for example the poem New Council, featuring an assembly of animals representing conservative views on how the king should govern. He also penned aphorisms, proverbs, and satire. A street in Pardubice bears his name, and his work is still read by students of Czech literature. Next is the Ronov family, one of the oldest and most notable of Czech aristocratic dynasties. The family expanded into numerous branches over generations, such as the lords of Dauba, Berka, the Lichtenbergs, Kshinets of Ronov, and so on. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the family split into the lords of Lipa, the Lichtenbergs, the lords of Dauba, the lords of Klingenstein, and more. The oldest known member of the dynasty was the late 12th century Smil Flashka of Duhan. His descendants carried high office at the royal court, thus acquiring considerable tracts of land, from which they acquired the family name. From Ronov in the Žitava region, in the Nice River Valley in present-day Poland. Ronov Castle of the same name, south of Česká Lípa, was built only at the end of the 14th century. The Ronov family is represented by one of the KCD characters, Janusz of Lipa. And here again we have a few sub-entries. First, Jan Ptacek, or Hans Capon. The underage son of Jan Ježek Ptacek and Hedvika of Dauba. After the death of his father, his family, the lords of Lipa, his uncle Henry, his son Janusz, and his brothers became his guardians. Young lord did not take possession of Rataj and hereditary estate in Polna until 1412. Soon afterwards he entered political life and he held positions in the provincial offices. After the imprisonment of Master Jan Hus, he signed a petition in his defense, but during the Hussite wars he was initially on the side of the League of Lords against the Hussites in a few minor battles. In 1419 he took part in a battle against the Hussites at Knin, apparently due to the influence of his close neighbor Racek of Kravar of Sternberg. There are no records indicating he took part in the war later. His son was Hynek Ptacek, who achieved high office in the Kingdom of Bohemia, becoming royal hofmeister and mince master. Then we have Jan Birdie Ježek. Jan Ježek, father of young Lord Jan Ptacek or Hans Capon, was a Moravian lord. In 1349 he became lord of the Honkovice estates. In 1357 lord of Polna Castle, which he acquired in exchange for Sloup Castle, Perkenstein, and in 1369 lord of Rataj, where he built a new parish church and renamed the lower castle Perkenstein or Birkstein. His son John was still a minor when he died, so the property was administered by his relatives. It did not pass back into the hands of the rightful heir until 1412. Ježek was the first of the lords of Lipa to hold the moniker Birdie or Ptacek. And the last of the Ronov family is Sir Janusz of Lipa. Following the death of Henry III of Birkstein in 1402, Janusz of Lipa became the guardian of the former's son Jan Ptacek, in KCD Hans Capon, and thus the acting governor of the surrounding province. He completed the construction of Birkstein and its fortifications and the local church of St. Matthew, which contains a shrine to his family. When Sigismund of Luxembourg invaded and burned Skalitz, the town's burgrave, Racek Kobyla, and the survivors of the raid found refuge with Hanush. Hanush subsequently took action against scattered groups of brigands and Cumans. His relationship with the king was peculiar to say the least, judging by often contradictory sources. It appears that in 1410 crown forces descended on the town of Ratai in Hanush domain, probably after he became a robber baron and rebel, who may also have participated in the siege of Jihlava in Moravia. Nevertheless, in 1414 he became a provincial marshal and dwelt together with his wife Marketa of Sternberg at Spielberg in Brno. Okay, just a few more. Next is the Zul family of Ostschedek. The story of the Zul Yemen family aptly illustrates the conditions that existed in Bohemia at the turn of the century. Even before the king's abduction, Bohemia was crawling with all sorts of bandit fellowships and fraternities, often led by the lower nobility. Execution records mention the Zul family name as of 1389, when Jan Zul and his father Mikuláš Zul are mentioned as leaders of a band of brigands that perpetrated pillaging raids from their base in Ostschedek. They were sometimes joined by Jan's uncle Hagen from the nearby fortress of Kresice. Their territory of operation consisted mostly of the trade routes between Prague, Kutna Hora or Gothenburg, and Benesov, as well as solitary mills. In fairness, it must be added that the testimonies of individual captured bandits or their associates implicated many millers and innkeepers from the surrounding villages of receiving stolen goods from the bandits or assisting them in other ways. These stolen goods were indeed varied in character. We learn from the execution books that the Zuls stole horses, cattle, and farm equipment, as well as merchandise such as cloth and barrels full of herring. Of course, money was also highly desirable loot. Around the turn of the century, the Zuls band seized Janow castle and extended their hunting ground. At the same time, they also fought with Procop of Luxembourg in his campaign against Sigismund, which nicely illustrates the attitude of the day to the criminality of the nobility. There was indeed a thin line between mercenary and bandit, very often depending on allegiances. It may have been on account of Procop that the Zuls plundered especially the lands of Sigismund's allies from the Rosenberg family. Little wonder then that most of the records we have about the Zuls come from the Rosenberg's execution books, which depict them in an unflattering light. In 1401, they abducted the parish priests from a Rosenberg village, probably in the expectation of a fat ransom, and later they further expanded their property by seizing Duba Castle, which belonged to their former allies. The Zuls' pillaging raids were only brought to an end by a punitive expedition by the Prague bishop Zbynek Zajic of Habsburg, who conquered both Duba and Janow. He then brought Mikuláš Zul and about 50 of his companions in captivity to Prague. Jan, the youngest of the Zuls, was captured and executed a year later. The bishop divided the Zuls' numerous properties, which included villages, woods, and farms among his allies, and left the family's descendants quite destitute. Ciechanów Castle was reduced to ruins during the punitive raid. It passed through the hands of several courtiers before becoming the property of Racek Kobyla in 1411. Kobyla built a new seat there called Komorny Hradek. The fate of Mikuláš Zul after his captivity is also interesting, because he was escorted to the gallows by none less than Jan Hus and hanged along with his comrades. According to chronicles of the time, the only concession accorded to his noble status was that he was hanged higher than the other outlaws. His body was then displayed hanging on a hook. The chronicles mention that 7 years later, a madman with the compulsion for burying executed convicts was wandering around Prague. Because he was unable to remove Zul's remains from the hook, he took at least one leg and left it with a female grocer, who later saw to a proper burial, and the body of Mikuláš Zul, albeit not in one piece, was finally laid to eternal rest behind the church of St. Stephen in the Rybníček, where it was customary at the time to inter executed individuals. 4 more entries. The Lords of Talmberg. The coat of arms of the Lords of Talmberg consists of 2 water lily leaves, argent, silver, on a field gules, red. The dynasty dates back to 1291, when Talmberg Castle was under the administration of William, son of the then Prague Burgrave, Rosnata of Dvojitz. His descendants later owned estates in South and East Bohemia, including Slatinany, Milicin, and the area around Czasław. Some of the Talmberg lords achieved such influential posts in administration as burgrave or magistrate. And then the first Lord of Talmberg is Sir Divish of Talmberg. Divish Stalmbergu owned Talmberg Castle in the years 1390 to 1415. In 1391, the castle was conquered and Divish was taken captive, and by his neighbor Havul Medek of Valdek, though we no longer know how the dispute arose between them. Due to the king's inability to settle the matter, Divish was imprisoned in his own castle for 7 long years while his young wife Stephanie attempted to raise the ransom to free him. Thanks to the help of friends, including Racek Kobyla, he was finally liberated and Medek was condemned for his actions as a rebel. From 1400 onwards, Divish held the office of Prague Burgrave and in 1401 moved his seat to Prague. Meanwhile, Talmberg Castle was repaired and he gave it to his wife. Divish returned there in 1414, and in 1418 his son Uldrich governed the estate. According to some sources, Divish died in 1415, while others attest that in 1418 Jan Jankowski sold him Jankov Castle, where the Talmberg family lived until 1702. Divish had 3 sons, Uldrich, Willem and Mikuláš, who governed Jankov from 1433 onwards. And another lord of Talmberg is William of Talmberg and Milicin. In 1297, the head of the provincial court, the direct founder of the Talmberg branch, and a direct bearer of the Hroznata coat of arms. The Hroznata family was one of the few that did not directly engage in the war against the king, so did not forfeit property. He founded Talmberg Castle. He had 2 sons, Divish and Nezamisu. And lastly, for today, is Wenceslas IV. Wenceslas IV of Luxembourg was the son of the highly successful monarch Charles IV. He inherited the Bohemian throne and attained the German crown by election. However, he did not inherit his father's predisposition for ruling. Already during his lifetime, he was known for being a weak, idle, and moody ruler who was afflicted with many ailments, as well as difficulties meeting his royal obligations, despite the fact that he had been groomed for rule since early childhood. He was crowned Bohemian king at the age of only 2 years. He was more interested in hunting, alcohol, courtesans, and pleasures of the court. During his time as king, the lands of the Bohemian crown underwent several wars and conflicts involving his relatives, his own brother Sigismund and his cousins, the Moravian margraves. The event that triggered the Margraviate Wars was that Wenceslas occupied the vacated estates of the Olomouc Archdiocese, which by law belonged to the nobles. Under the leadership of Jobst, the Moravian lords joined with Sigismund in open revolt against the king, which had less to do with the Olomouc estates than with the legitimacy of the rule of Wenceslas, who in the meantime had been stripped of the imperial crown by the imperial electors for his incompetence and unwillingness to rule. Later he also lost the power of the Bohemian crown, when he made numerous concessions and awarded the nobles many privileges, de facto transferring the ruling power to them. His unwillingness to meet obligations resulted in his abduction twice, thereby removing him from the throne. First in 1394 by the Czech nobles, and then in 1402 by his brother Sigismund. Wenceslas initially supported the reform proposals of Jan Hus and his adherents, but he did nothing to save the reformer's life when he was sentenced to be burned at the stake by the church. He thus set in motion what was later to become the largest and only more or less successful popular revolt in Europe, the Hussite Wars. However, he did not live to see these events, since he died in 1419. After his death, his brother Sigismund of Hungary seized the crown, but he had to fight for it, since not everyone acknowledged his claim, and once he had the crown, he did not live to enjoy it for long. Alright. This wasn't nearly as lengthy as the general section. Whether that's a good thing or not is up to you, I suppose. There is still the society section, which seems kind of interesting. The events section, which is very short, and the locations section, which I would also like to read. Maybe, I'm not sure, maybe locations and events I can do in one video, and then society in its own separate video, because it seems by far the longest of the three that are left. As you can hear, my voice is a bit shot, but yeah, that's it for this one. As always, thank you very much for watching, although this time I suppose it's mostly for listening. Take care, and I will talk to you next time. Bye bye.